As an indie game developer, you wear a lot of hats. After all, we're making games here. You've got to be a programmer, a marketer, a designer, and so much more. But even with all these roles, we sometimes prioritize one over another. A lot of game devs, myself included, think of themselves as programmers first and everything else second. So when we start on a game, we have tons of fun programming awesome mechanics using blank squares or capsules. But eventually we have to release our games, and nobody's going to want to play a game with bad art. At this point, you could hire an artist, ask a friend to join your team, or use an asset pack. But what if you're stubborn like me and want to do everything solo? Well, in this video, I'll be explaining some of the techniques I use to make my games go from looking like this to this. Yeah, they're not Hollow Knight, but they're definitely serviceable. And most importantly, I haven't had any extensive art training. I just found ways to unlock my inner kinda good at art. So let's get started. In my past videos, I've talked at length about planning your games from day one. For a quick recap, you should plan your core features first, those are your basic game mechanics, then your axes of expansion, things like levels or skins, then finally your schedule. So where does art fit in there? Well, I would argue that your game's art style is a core feature, something you should develop and plan alongside the movement mechanics and basic story. This extends to prototyping as well. When you're building a prototype of your core features, you should also draw a few sprites or make some 3D models to develop your game's art style. You can still use gray boxes and capsules in most places, but your prototype should give you a good idea of what your game will look like. Take this prototype I did last year called Deck Dojo. There's still plenty of gray boxing if you know where to look, but I also drew a ton of player animations, environment assets, and enemies. In fact, I used the prototyping phase as an opportunity to change some of the NPC designs. The security guard went from looking like this to this. Once you figured out a style you like, the next step is to plan out how much art you're willing to make. Let's say I decided to make a pixel art game, and I estimate that I can make a decent pixel art sprite in 10 minutes and an animation in 20. So if I have an enemy with 10 animations, that'll take about 3 hours to animate. If I have 20 enemies in the whole game, that's 60 hours of development time just for the enemies. If I decide I only want to spend 30 hours animating the enemies, that'll cut it down to 10 in the game, or maybe I'll decide to have fewer animations per enemy. Either way, drawing, modeling, and animation could suck up a lot of time. So we need every trick in the book to make it as simple and efficient as possible, which leads me to my next tip. Of course, it probably goes without saying here that I'm not talking about AAA games. I mean retro or indie titles here. Think Undertale, not Uncharted. This can be even better if your game already has an inspiration behind it, like how my game Breezy was inspired by 3D Mario games, so I drew on Mario 64 for a low poly aesthetic and the environment assets. For this technique, it helps to start out by drawing some concept art, then recreating it in your style of choice. Do this a few times and you'll get a good idea of what works in that style. Of course, you can add your own flair. Breezy certainly doesn't look exactly like Mario 64. It has some post-processing and it uses Unity's terrain system for high poly landscapes. But basing your art style on another game gives you a good jumping off point. Look at it this way. Either your game ends up looking exactly like its inspiration, think Shovel Knight looking very similar to Mega Man, or it looks somewhat unique while still paying homage to older games. You really can't go wrong. One reason I mention this technique is because I'm using it in this Godot prototype that I've been making for the past few weeks. Since the gameplay is kinda similar to Cave Story, one of my favorite indie games, I'm basing the art off of that game as well. And Cave Story works great because it also exemplifies my next point. Using simple shapes is important in all games, but you'll get the most mileage out of it in cartoon-style games. Of course, you could just go all the way and make Thomas Was Alone or Geometry Dash, but I prefer to alter them at least a bit. After all, simple shapes are only a few steps away from really appealing characters or assets. Think about the two most iconic cartoon characters. They're literally 3 circles and square. And I try to apply this to my own characters as well. Take Zippy, whom I designed for a game jam last year. He's a walking zipper, which gave me a pretty good shape to start with. He's basically a trapezoid, so you could think of him as a cut-off triangle or a stretched-out rectangle. He's got blobs for legs, 2 circle eyes, and a crescent mouth, and there you go. Or take the Steam capsule art for Breezy. Rather than an in-game screenshot, I decided to stylize the game's world a little bit. So I made these bushes out of spheres, and I made all the levels the same shape. Or if you're going for more complex designs, you can use simple shapes as an anchor point. Take the main character from Deck Dojo. He's got these round circular glasses and rectangular limbs that break down his character into a few shapes. But if you're moving towards more complex assets, you'll need this next tip. As I mentioned when talking about simple shapes, this technique can be used for all games, but you'll see it more often for realistic art styles. But certainly don't discount real-world modeling when it comes to cartoony games either. The best example here is with modeling and animating humanoid characters. Take a run cycle. It's impossible to make a decent run cycle without studying how it looks and feels to run. The first run cycle I made for Deck Dojo had the character's legs awkwardly swinging around like a robot. Eventually I revamped the animation to make it more realistic, and it looks a whole lot better. Even for more simplistic art, introducing an element of realism can look very refreshing. For the special shrine course in Breezy, I researched real Japanese lanterns and even the type of lumber that are native to Japan so I could accurately make these logs and fences, and I really like the result. Of course, realism isn't the end-all be-all of any art style. Don't be afraid to fall back on video gamey stereotypes if that's the clearest way to convey something. A classic example is yellow paint pointing the way forward, but there are examples of this sort of thing everywhere. Here's something that definitely hasn't been pointed out in every YouTube video ever. Did you know that these bushes and these clouds in the original Super Mario Bros. Are actually the same sprite but recolored? Yeah, hold your applause till the end please. But there's a reason people point it out. You probably wouldn't have noticed otherwise. But if the enemies in that game are just recolored versions of Mario's sprite, it would feel cheap and out of place. So why do I bring this up? Well, I want to make the point that it's fine to reuse your own art as long as you're clever with it. Reusing art is quick and it helps develop a consistent style for the game, but there's a fine line to walk. Take this black vinyl material in Breezy. Of course I use it on the spinning record in the Remix Rush menu, but I also use it on the head of this turret. Or this flag cloth material. Once again, I obviously used it on the flag, but it's also the body on this butterfly. This helps create a consistent color scheme for the game and it reduces the amount of materials I have to make. But once again, it's a fine line to walk. I was pretty subtle about it in Breezy, but other games are more liberal in what art they choose to recycle. It all depends on your style and constraints. The most important step is to avoid making your game samey and boring. This can get especially hard for programmers. We're taught to make our code reusable, so why not make our art the same way? But for my programmers especially, this tip might help with that. If you consider yourself a programmer, as I do, your natural urge is probably to shift as much effort as possible off of art and onto programming. And the best way to do that is tech art. You may or may not have heard of this term, but it describes a lot of what we do as game devs, programming effects, materials, and art assets to look how we want. The canonical example is fancy water shaders, but it encompasses a lot more than that. For example, if you're making a particle system, that's tech art. If you're programming screen shake, I'd call that tech art. And speaking of screen shake, tech art is really great for adding game feel, also known as juice, to your game. Take Deck Dojo again. When you hit an enemy, you see the knockback, but you also see these particles and some slight freeze frame and screen shake. Game feel, and tech art in general, can play a big part in making your game feel finished and professional. Add enough juice and people will forgive a lot of mediocre art. Even in a game with otherwise good art, the right tech art will elevate it to the next level. Take Celeste. The pixel art by itself was nothing to write home about, but add in the subtle procedural animation and tech art and it looks amazing. But remember that tech art takes practice, just like regular programming and art. Even if you're great at gameplay programming, you might not be great at tech art the first few times you try it. Just like every other part of game dev, stick with it and you'll find success. So, those are some tips from a non-artist who makes art anyway. And yes, after all these years, I still don't consider myself an artist deep inside. Not visual art, at least. But I preach the mantra, fake it till you make it. And that applies to art most of all. Because if it looks like good art, then it is good art. But before I end off the video, I have a few more rapid-fire tips. First, avoid AI art at all costs. People can tell when something is AI generated and it just looks tacky. A human drawing has so much more charm, even if it's bad. In fact, I would even avoid AI art for the prototyping or concept stages. It just primes you to turn that art into something that looks AI generated. My next tip is to be intentional about your colors. It's a good idea to keep a color palette handy, like this one for my Godot game. Plan how each color interacts with the others and reuse colors when possible. If that sounds like too much work, at least pick one or two touchstone colors to base your game off of, like what I call breezy yellow. I even have the hex code memorized by heart, FFE42B. Finally, once you've made your art, take a lot of screenshots and GIFs. When we play the game, we feel how the programming and game design interact with the art, but nobody will download your game to do that unless the art looks good in pictures or videos. So post lots of screenshots and GIFs, or at least peruse them to see what needs work. Oh, and one more tip, if you've watched this whole video, comment your own tips below, or join my Discord and show off some of your game art. But whatever you do, have a good day.